Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the York Civil War Roundtable for our March 16th, 2022 meeting. My name is Adam Bentz, and I am the Assistant Director of Library and Archives at the York County History Center, and we are very happy, as always, for our partnership in working with the York Civil War Roundtable and being able to host this event either in person, as we were able in the past, or online, as we've been doing for quite some time now. So if you could bear with me for a few moments, I'd like to share some upcoming events that we have going on at the History Center over the next few weeks or so. Starting tomorrow evening, that's St. Patrick's Day, March 17th at 7:00 p.m., we will be welcoming Sandra Kearse Stockton, who is a local author, the author of 2 books in her 3-book series, 480 Cadorus Street, Surviving Unpredictability and Trials and Tribulations. We'll be welcoming her to present information to discuss her first book, Surviving Unpredictability. And please check out our website for more information on registering for this. This is an all-virtual presentation, which will be taking place on Zoom. A week from tonight, on Wednesday, the 23rd of March at 7 p.m., we'll be welcoming our other partner organization, the All Vets organization, which does oral histories with veterans. And All Vets will be inviting Bob Zimmerman to speak. Bob is an Army veteran who served in Korea in 1972 and also later served at the Pentagon. The All Vets is meeting in person at the Historical Society Museum, and it is also live streamed on Zoom. So please join us for that. The next event taking place all the way in April, which seems like a long time from now, but based on today's weather, maybe April is around the corner. That's taking place on Sunday, the 6th of April at 2:30 p.m. in the afternoon. The South Central Pennsylvania Genealogical Society will be meeting and hosting Tom Gibson, who will be presenting the challenges facing the Continental Congress in Yorktown, Pennsylvania. So for those of you who are not in the know, York was actually host to the Continental Congress for 9 months between 1777 and 1778. Some historians would argue 2 of the most pivotal, if not the most pivotal years of the American Revolution. And we're fortunate to have that legacy in York. And so Tom will be discussing the problems Congress faced. Please note, for those of you who have attended South Central meetings in the past, they usually are held at our main museum on Market Street, but this will be held very appropriately at the History Center's Colonial Courthouse replica, which is located at Market and Pershing. So please keep that in mind. If you show up on East Market Street, we're not going to be there. So just turn around and go back to the courthouse. That is an in-person event, but will also be live streamed on Zoom. Okay, advancing the slide. There we go. A month from now, our next Civil War Roundtable meeting on April 20th, taking place at 7 p.m. And I'm saying probably on Zoom, although we have been reevaluating things recently at the History Center and also in our discussion with Kathy Friel and Scott Rosenau and Scott Mingus, who are the program directors of the Roundtable. And we've been engaging in a discussion on when we're able to go back to in-person and what that's going to look like. But at this point, for April 20th, we're saying probably on Zoom. But we will be welcoming back Scott Mingus, who I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, are very familiar with all of his work. And Scott will be presenting A Carnival of Grief, The Lincoln Funeral Train in Pennsylvania. And this is a book that Scott actually just published, I believe, in January of 2022, if not at the very end of 2021. And his talk, it will be on the following subject: the funeral train carrying the remains of the slain President Abraham Lincoln passed through the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania on April 21st to 22nd, 1865, on its way to New York City, and again passed through Pennsylvania on April 28th as it headed west from Buffalo to Cleveland and passed through the Erie region. Tens of thousands of Pennsylvanians passed by the coffin as Lincoln lay in state in Harrisburg and Philadelphia. Massive, untold numbers of residents watched the funeral train slowly stream past their farms, small towns, communities, and whistle stops. Many left personal reminiscences. So Scott has tapped into these often obscure or rare diaries and journal entries, coupled with the eyewitness accounts of a small cadre of big city reporters on board the train and those newsmen in the towns through which the train passed, to present a detailed yet highly readable account of the funeral train's passage through Pennsylvania. He includes overviews of the locomotives used, the crewmen, the railroads the train used, timetables, and other interesting aspects. So I think everybody loves Lincoln, so I think that could be very enjoyable and probably a very popular talk. So please don't forget to join us in a month from now. It seems like it can't be a month, right? To April 20th, it seems impossibly far, but the third Wednesday evening of April, we will be meeting again on Zoom. And I've been asked by Kathy Friel to present the following memoriam in honor of Kimberly Shaida. For many of you that are in the email list, you received an email from Scott Rosenau a few weeks ago after her passing. And Kathy wanted to dedicate tonight's program in her memory. Longtime member Kimberly Shaida passed away on Sunday, February 20th, 2022. She will be greatly missed as she was a regular attendee at our monthly meetings, always volunteered for our Adopt a Position site cleanup at Gettysburg National Military Park, attended our battlefield walks with Dr. Charlie Fennell, and assisted with our book raffles prior to our shutdown during the COVID pandemic. She was very instrumental in helping the Roundtable procure the North York Borough Hall back in 2005 as a meeting place after the Roundtable was forced to leave Borders Books and Music, where we had met since 1997. Kim would often suggest potential speakers for future programs, and tonight's speaker, Ron Coddington, was suggested by her for Women's History Month. We are fortunate tonight to be able to follow through with Kim's last request and know that she will be watching from heaven and resting in eternal peace. Our heartfelt condolences and deepest sympathies are extended to Kim's husband, Tom, her son, Matt, and daughter, Becky. We are truly sorry for your loss. So like I said at the beginning, we'd like to dedicate tonight's program presented by Mr. Coddington in her memory, and we wish her family the very best. So I'd like to introduce Ron. Before I forget to say it, if you can, we'd like to hold questions until the end of tonight's presentation as a usual practice. But Ron is an active collector of Civil War era carte de visite. I am not good at pronouncing French. And he is the author of 5 books that document the lives of citizen soldiers in blue and gray: Faces of the Civil War, Faces of the Confederacy, African-American Faces of the Civil War, Faces of Civil War Nurses, Faces of Civil War Navies, and Faces of Civil War Nurses. He is formerly a columnist for the Civil War News and contributing author to the award-winning New York Times series Disunion. Ron has more than 30 years experience as a journalist at USA Today, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, the San Jose Mercury News, and the Chronicle of Higher Education. So without further ado, I will turn things over to Ron.
Adam, thank you so much for the welcome and the introduction. I want to add my voice to the chorus of condolences for Kim. I never had the opportunity to meet her, but when you and Kathy told me her story and that she had suggested this program for this evening, it really moved me. And I've told a number of friends of mine, and they have been equally moved by Kim's example and her spirit. So it's wonderful to hear all about her. And I agree with all of you in the roundtable and however you came in contact with her. So please know that I trust that she's here with us tonight. And hopefully you will all keep her in your hearts and minds forever and ever. So thank you for that. And with that, I think Kim was right on in thinking about talking about Civil War nurses as an appropriate topic for Women's History Month. I think it's also interesting to note the fact that we're talking about the roles of this incredibly intrepid group of women who braved so much in service of their country to deal with battle wounded and folks who were suffering from disease and other illnesses. And when I think about that in context to the pandemic, and I think about all of the heroic caregivers that we all have seen in our communities on television and elsewhere, it really sort of brings it home for me. So I'm going to share my screen and we'll get the presentation going here. All right. So I can't think of a better place to start with than with the cover of the book. This is Marie Leonard. She was during the war period, she was Marie Tepe, and talk about difficulty with French and other languages. A vivandière is what she was what her role was. And she represents a very, very small segment of women who participated in the war in the unusual way of joining a regiment. Being a vivandière is connected to Europe in the 19th century, this idea of following a regiment and providing various services from cleaning, cooking, to caring for injured. This was a role that she brought from France when she emigrated to the United States in the early 1850s, following her husband into the war. And her story is the stuff of legend. I provided a quote here, which comes from a regimental history before the Battle of Fredericksburg. According to the story, she was up on the front lines, and the commanding officer in front of the line was sending back all the non-combatants, which included Marie, who, by the way, is known as French Mary. She was known at that time, sending French Mary and the other musicians to the back. Mary, or Marie, refused to go. And as the quote goes, she looked at the commanding officer in the face and she said, "Maybe I'm not so scared as you are," laughed loudly, and made no sign of obedience. That is until a bullet reportedly grazed her ankle. And at that point, she decided to head to the back of the regiment. So there you have a little flavor and just one sense of how a woman could become involved in the Civil War. It's important to note that the majority of women stayed in their towns where they provided an incredible service to make supplies, to raise money, and to support the troops. And this happened in varying degrees on both sides, the Union side and the Confederate side. If you were a paid caregiver or a volunteer on the US side, you had a fair amount of options. You could do what Marie did and become involved through the Army. You could follow the paths of many others by getting involved in local and state charities. You could volunteer or be paid with the Christian Commission, which was a very large organization across the country. You could also get involved with the Sanitary Commission, just perhaps the best known national organization. The US Sanitary Commission served the eastern part of the country and the Western Sanitary Commission in the West. If you were on the southern side of the equation, you really did not have the opportunity to serve in more of a national way. And when you think about it, the truth becomes a little plainer with the success of invading Union armies, with the success of the Union blockade along the Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico. Supplies, modes of transportation, a changing military situation on the ground as the war progressed, made it very difficult for national organizations to get off the ground. So for a Southern woman, your best opportunity was service to the Army or through local and state charities, but it was mostly a local involvement. Now, I don't know how new you are to Civil War nurses or Civil War or the role of women during this conflict, but one of the most frequently asked questions that I receive is, well, what uniform did they wear? And the truth is, there isn't really an exact uniform, which makes it interesting and challenging when you're searching visual records to try to find photographs. I know when I think of nurse and war, I think of the distinctive World War I and World War II uniforms that were worn. Well, there's not really an equivalent during the Civil War. So I wanted to share these four images because I think they give you some sense of what type of garb you might see worn by a woman. So the first one is Marie, and you can see she has a very uniquely designed uniform, which includes a short dress with trousers and boots. The cask that she carries is a holdover from Europe that normally contained water, but it could contain other spirits, I suppose, but probably water. You can see that she is also armed. She has a revolver and a holster on the front, and she's wearing a modified jacket. The regiment that she is best known was a Zouave regiment. And so you can see the Zouave influence with the number of small buttons and the tombeau design on her shell jacket. She also is wearing the Corps badge that distinguishes her, that German cross. So that's a custom type of uniform that vary greatly depending upon the regiment and the individual, very individualistic. The next woman is Helen Gilson. I'll talk a little bit more about her later. She's wearing an outfit that is probably maybe a bit closer to what you might think of as a uniform as defined by Dorothea Dix. Dorothea Dix is perhaps a name that you are familiar with. She was the chief of the Army nurses. She was looking for very plain dress. She did not want to excite the soldiers in any way. Silk and color was not part of her methodology when choosing clothing. And so plain, more homespun type of garb, simple garb, was more along the lines of what she was looking for. So Helen might have been pushing the envelope a little bit here when you see the decorative border across the bottom of her dress, her cuffs, her collar. All of that is a bit decorative, but I imagine that the net effect was probably fairly muted compared to other fancier clothes that women of the time were wearing. The next woman is Mary Morris' husband, and I'll talk a little bit about her later on as well. Mary is also wearing a dress that I think Dorothea Dix would approve of. you can see it appears to be fairly simple. And you can see it looks like maybe a flannel or a heavy cotton, or a linen even, that has some creasing in it, a dark cloth that seems to be rather muted. She's also wearing an apron, and that apron is something that she custom designed. And the apron plays an important part in her story, which I'll get to, as I mentioned, a little bit. The last individual, the fourth individual, is Sister Ignatius Farley, and she is wearing a nun's habit. I suspect you immediately spotted that as soon as I put the slide up, but it was not uncommon for women of faith who were involved in a church, attached to a religion, a particular religion, to wear the clothes of their order. So here she is, and she probably looked exactly like this when she was in a hospital attending patients. Now, it's very difficult to talk about the Civil War without acknowledging Florence Nightingale. I thought it was interesting. In my travels, I didn't find a lot of references to her and her deeds. I did find in letters and diaries and other writings that her name is evoked often when people would say something like, well, if you're looking for Florence Nightingale, she's right here working in this regiment or working in this hospital. So there's a lot of references to her as someone in the US who was embodying the spirit of who she was. And it makes legitimate and perfect sense. Florence Nightingale, the pioneer of nursing. I love this quote. She says, every woman, or at least most every woman in England, has at one time or another of her life charge of the personal health of somebody, whether child or invalid. In other words, every woman is a nurse. Now hold on to that last part. Every woman is a nurse, because you will see this a little bit later on. Those words, by the way, come from the preface of her book, Notes on Nursing, What It Is and What It Is Not. And that is published during in the 1850s. And because she is part of the volunteer group that goes to Crimea, the book comes out of her experiences. Never been able to find an image of her in the Crimean War, but here's an image of a Mrs. Rogers in the Crimea. I want to believe that Florence Nightingale was probably in surroundings that looked like this, and probably not unfamiliar to those of you who study Civil War photographs. It has sort of that same feel, and the two wars are separated by less than 10 years. So, to try to understand Florence Nightingale's impact on women and nurses in the United States, I did a survey of newspaper references, American newspaper references to her between 1845 and 1865. And what you'll see here is in 1854, when she's beginning to attract notice, she starts to be mentioned in American newspapers. And during the war, 1855, 1856, 57, 58, when her book comes out, you can see those numbers are increasing. There's a little bit of a drop off in 1859, and then the book comes to America. The American edition comes to America in 1860. The references shoot up, and then they slip back down a little bit during the war years. So it seems entirely plausible, at least these numbers suggest, that her book had an impact, and that impact lands in America right on the verge within a year of the beginning of the Civil War. So her 1860 version, the American version that's published in 1860, includes a biographical sketch. And it appears that the sketch was added because it doesn't appear in the British edition. It seems to be added to acquaint or reacquaint Americans who may have heard her mention but weren't exactly sure who they were. So she adds this quote, which I happen to think is wonderful in the way that it sort of combines the glorification of war along with the tragedies of war. And she says, surely, if there was heroism in dashing up the heights of Alma, seeking glory at the cannon's mouth in defiance of death and of mortal opposition, amid the shouts of the victors and the cries of the vanquished, there was heroism unparalleled in calmly volunteering to minister to the fever-stricken and the dying. So here she is on the cusp of the Civil War, talking about the glory and the valor of the soldier in uniform, and she's balancing that against the heroism of the women nurses who are tending to those men after they fall in battle or become ill from disease. So really lifting up the role of women as nurses, and that clearly had an impact on American women as they became involved in the war. Over in America, you have women. Among those women who responded is Georgie Bacon. Her name is Georgiana, but she was known as Georgie to all of her friends. And she makes the point here of saying, she sort of brings up the challenges of being a woman in a man's world in 1861. And that is not only true in the military, but it is also true on the medical side of the Army. She says, no one knows who did not watch the thing from the beginning, how much opposition, how much ill will, how much unfeeling want of thought these women nurses endured. She's talking about how they were mistreated by men, by doctors. And she says, hardly a surgeon whom I can think of received or treated them with even common courtesy. So she doesn't stop there. She goes on to talk more about that. She says, these annoyances could not have been endured by the nurses, but for the knowledge that they were pioneers who were, if possible, to gain standing ground for others who must create the position they wished to occupy. Now, this is Georgie Bacon, a nurse, someone of some education, who is basically realizing that her shoulders and her sister nurses are the shoulders upon which future generations of women who are caregivers and perhaps in other occupations are going to stand. That is a very prescient, a very futuristic vision that's happening in 1861. So when you think of women's history and think of how we're celebrating it, Georgie is cognizant of what the future is going to be. Now, another face and a name, you know, Clara Barton, not to be outdone by Florence Nightingale, she has her own connection to men and to war. She draws that same distinction between glory on the battlefield by the men and the heroism of women. And she basically is picking up on Florence Nightingale's idea, but she puts it, she casts it in the words of more of medieval knights. She goes way romantic on this connection. And she says, and I'll read it to you because it's good to hear it spoken aloud. While they march on with tread of iron and plumes, proudly tossing in the breeze, someone must follow closely in their steps, crouching to the earth, toiling in the rain and darkness, shelterless like themselves, with no thought of pride, of glory, fame, or praise, or reward, hearts breaking with pity, face bathed in tears, and hands in blood. This is the side which history never shows. Now, I've talked a lot here so far about Clara Barton and Dorothea Dix. They are elevated figures. If you know, to women with connections to the Civil War, you know these two. I chose not to include profiles in the book about them because they are so well known and because they are referenced numerous times within the profiles of the other women. And the same is true with Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman. I chose not to include profiles of them. All four of these women are absolutely worthy of having profiles and having a prominent part, but they've had such great recognition in recent times, certainly. And I have no doubt that they will get more attention. I wanted to use the book to shine a spotlight on those women who may never again see the light of day. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the origins of the book. It goes back to 2004. I went to the book festival in Baltimore. This book and all of my books, including Faces of Civil War Nurses, are published by Johns Hopkins. So Baltimore was a great place to start a tour. The book was Faces of the Civil War, was very well received. And at the end of the book festival, my editor, Bob Bruger, came up to me and shocked me when he said, "What are you going to do next?" And I never, ever thought about a second book. I put all my energies and all my passion into this book with absolutely no thought about what I would do. And Bob suggested doing a book about women. And I was really nervous about that because I had come to rely on military service records, military pension files, and other government documents to talk about these men and to put their lives in context. I knew that women probably didn't have as deep a record, and so I sort of pushed it off a little bit, but Bob had planted a seed, and I knew someday that I would begin to do it, begin to take on the subject. The other problem I had was photography. To be able to find original wartime identified photographs of women who served as nurses proved a challenge for me. I did not see many that were in private collections and public institutions. I would oftentimes find Civil War photographs of men who their name, their regiment would be written on the back in beautiful period ink, and I could easily prove their identities. In the case of women's photographs, I didn't find as much of that to be the case. It would say something like Mrs. Robert A. Smith. And I would go, and it might even say Civil War nurse. It was like Mrs. Robert A. Smith trying to track it down. It became a real challenge. All of that changed in 2014 when I met Chris Ford. Chris has an amazing collection of I believe over 3,000 documents related to nursing in the Civil War and other periods in the 19th century, including photographs. And one day, Chris came over to my house with a big plastic bucket filled with images. I was overwhelmed, scanned a bunch of images, and we did a gallery of a collection, representative examples of those images in Military Images, which is a magazine that I edit and publish. That was in 2014. And at that point, having seen all of Chris's photographs, I knew that I had the makings of a book. So Chris provided a number of images that ultimately became part of the book. I also cast a net out and began searching other large collections. One of the great hidden secrets, or at least hidden for me, was at Carlisle Barracks, up in Carlisle Barracks in your state, Pennsylvania. You may be familiar with the Mollus collection, Mollus. The Mollus collection, it's something like 125 volumes with period images in it of Civil War soldiers, scenes of camp life. Tucked away in a couple parts are a handful of images of nurses, many of which haven't received a lot of attention. So I was able to pull some images from that collection. When all was said and done, I was able to find 32 images from Chris Ford's collection. I picked up another 22 from the Mollis collection at Carlisle Barracks. Other private collectors, I got 13, and then 10 more from libraries and historical societies. So if you're a mathematician and add those numbers up, you should get 77. That number, that's the number of profiles in the book. There's no special significance to that other than 77 was a good number for my first book, Faces of the Civil War. And so I kept that number consistent through the rest of the books. So if you are someone who is interested in photo collecting, or if you've been to antique shops, antique shows, you've seen those paper images. Adam talked about it a little bit at the beginning of the program, cartes de visite. These are paper prints on cardstock mounts. They came to America around 1859, 1860, and became all the rage in America. It's the first, first commercial portrait that you can make multiple prints from a negative, in this case, a glass plate negative. You would buy them a dozen at a time and hand them out to your friends, your family, your comrades, and they would wind up in photo albums. Photo albums were invented for cartes de visite. And so it's perhaps no surprise that the majority of images in the book are cartes de visite. Think about it as the Facebook of the 1860s. Tintypes make up a much smaller number. Tintypes were still very vibrant and still a medium, a format of choice for many individuals. The way that I like to describe it is if you think about the carte de visite as being social media, the tintypes were very personal. These were one-of-a-kind objects, artisanal, that you would give to a loved one, a wife, a sister, a brother, your parents, and it would ultimately wind up on a bookshelf, on the hearth, on a bedroom stand. So now a word about the research went into the book. One of the challenges I had was, what's the criteria for inclusion? What exactly is a nurse during the Civil War? And that's hard to answer because a nurse could be paid, could be unpaid. The way they nursed, the way they had training or didn't have training. Some had formal training. Some had training by example. Some fell into the war more or less accidentally. So in trying to sort all this out and come up with a definition, I ultimately discovered that there's a common element. And the common element is this: if you tended to one soldier that was wounded, and I should add sick, one wounded or sick soldier in some capacity on at least one occasion, I count you as a caregiver or a nurse. And this takes different forms. If you want to think about it in terms of personas, the types of women who would become involved, you've got someone like Jessie Fremont. I know you know her name, the wife of John C. Fremont, Republican presidential candidate, the Pathfinder. She is often discussed as being easily his peer and sometimes his superior. She had minimal contact. I was only able to find one example where she visited a hospital. However, that counts as someone who was a nurse, and she went on to play a significant role in the formation of the Western Sanitary Commission. So another persona is an individual or a woman who becomes a nurse to take care of one specific individual. And I can't think of a better representative of that than Fanny Ricketts. When her husband, James, was critically wounded at the First Battle of Bull Run, she hired a coach, went out across the Virginia landscape into no man's land, went into Confederate lines, found her dangerously wounded husband, nursed him as best she could, ultimately became something of a prisoner of war because she followed her now captured husband off to Richmond to be imprisoned. They both survive their experience. I found no other record that Fanny took care of another soldier. Another persona is an individual where the war comes to their home. And as you might imagine, this is particularly true of the Southern nurses. And Carrie McGavock, the Battle of Franklin, her home, Coddington, is in the middle of the battle. Some of you may know the story of how she was in her house and inviting the Confederate wounded men to come in. They were lining the hallways in the room. Surgery was performed on the tables. Her dress was getting soggy around the edges from the blood as it was draping across the floor. There's no evidence that she actively sought to become a nurse, but when that moment came and she was confronted with a humanitarian crisis on her doorstep, she reacted and helped. Another persona, it was when the war comes to your city. And you have Elizabeth Smith. Her husband, Caleb Smith, is one of Abraham Lincoln's cabinet. And she, when the war happens and the hospitals in Washington begin to fill up, she makes it her role to visit these hospitals, to tend to the wounded. She is perhaps best known for serving a Christmas dinner for 25,000 injured and wounded men in those Washington hospitals. This is a particular interesting photograph of her because you can see that she's standing against a backdrop. That backdrop is a painting. And if you look closely, I hope you can see it in the video, you can see a bunch of beds that are lined up against the wall. There are individuals in those beds, and there is a woman with tightly pulled back hair, which looks very much like Elizabeth's hair, and she's standing there with what appears to be a tray. So this is a portrait that honors her service in making sure that all of those men got their Christmas dinner. Another persona, best represented by Marianne Beckerdijk. She's representative of many women who went off on their own hook with the support in terms of money and supplies from her hometown. And this plays out again and again and again across the northern states. Bad news about the hometown boys makes it to their town. That bad news is usually our boys are dying from disease. They don't have the care and the treatment they need. And the hometown rallies, and they send representatives like Marianne off to the camps to be able to bring supplies and to provide care. In Marianne's case, she stays the entire war. She's there with General Sherman as the armies are moving to Tennessee and Georgia at Chattanooga. She's enduring camp life with these men. So she not only struck off to find the war, she stuck with it through the rest of the war. Anna Stubbs, she's actually better known as Annie, but her real first name is Anna. She is representative of many women who went through official channels. She filled out the paperwork, she passed the examination, and they let her in, and she is formally appointed to various hospitals in the Union close to the Union armies. So you may not recognize her in this image, but you will most certainly recognize her in this one. This is an image of her taken in early February 1864. It was done for a sanitary commission fair. They were planning to sell this image to raise money for supplies and to help wounded and sick soldiers. At first, Annie objected because she was nervous about her name and her face being part of a brand. That's very much a 21st century problem. Annie's dealing with it in the 19th century. She realizes in the end that she needed to do her part for the country and for the military. She acquiesces and the image is sold. So a quick word on primary source documents. I know you have, I was talking to Adam tonight about a genealogy program coming up. I use census and genealogy records from Ancestry, military pensions and other files from fold3.com or by visiting the National Archives. That's visiting the archives is a problem right now because we still are in the residual effects of the pandemic as it transitions to an endemic, but I'm sure they will be opening their doors soon. Newspapers, particularly newspapers.com and the Library of Congress, they can be fantastic searches for local information. And lastly, books, letters, and diaries. You can find them in archive.org and by the incredible number of photograph and ephemera collectors scattered about the country. I'll throw out, if you're looking for some books to get a better sense of women during the Civil War, if you can get past some of the Victorian language, you will find some really great information. Woman's Work in the Civil War, published in 1867, and Women of the War, also published in 1867. Both books that contain a number of profiles, relatively short profiles. It gives you a real flavor of what was going on. Keep in mind, these books were written in 1867, so they're written soon after the war. They don't have the benefit of 100 or more years like I have had, but you'll find some great primary source information that's in there. A couple of other books, 3 Weeks at Gettysburg. It's literally no more than 20 pages. It's a pamphlet. Georgie Woolsey Bacon, who I mentioned earlier in the program, she wrote her reminiscences she wrote her story while it was still fresh in her mind of her time at Gettysburg. It's a wonderful read. Also by Georgie and her sister Eliza, who was also a nurse, Letters of a Family. That comes out in 1899, and another excellent book. And last but not least, a sketch of life and labors of Miss Catherine S. Lawrence. It is her story of her journey from New York to Washington, D.C. and to Northern Virginia, and her experiences with freedmen. Now, sometimes when I'm researching, I will have these great experiences where I'll find something, find a quote like this one from Harriet Dada while she was in Chattanooga writing in a book called Ministering Angel that connects her experience with the Civil War with photography. She says, often as I passed through the wards, the tears would dim in the eyes of patients as they spoke of a wife or a mother or a sister at home and showed me the photograph of some dear one that they had sacredly preserved. These images and these stories are my specific area of interest. And I think that in being able to preserve these images and to preserve these stories and share them with today's Americans and future Americans, we not only keep these stories alive, but we help to keep the war and our history relevant so that future generations can learn and be aware of who we are and where we came from. So that leads to the question of motivations. Why did they do it? Why did these women become involved? You won't be surprised to know that it's pretty much for the same reasons that the men became involved. Duty to country. Ruth Mayhew following a Maine regiment off to the war, and she says it in her writings. She did it because of her patriotism, her love of country, her matriotism. Another reason, you often hear about brothers going off to war. One goes first or they all enlist. Mary Telford, she enlisted because one of her brothers was in the army. She wanted to do her part. Faith. Sister Shorb gets into the war. She feels it is her duty. It's her spiritual duty to serve these men in need. Social reformers, the progressive wing of the country, they want to do good. They step up. Georgie Stradling saw an opportunity, not at first to become a nurse, but her interest was in African Americans. She realized, had read stories about the freed men, the women, the children who were becoming displaced and needed to be cared for. They needed to be educated because in expectations of them becoming citizens, they needed to learn about the country. And so Georgie set off to Washington to become a teacher to help these individuals make the transition from enslaved people to citizens. She ultimately serves a stint as a nurse as she gets caught up in the war and in Washington is seeing the impossibly large numbers of wounded and sick men in area hospitals. A very, very, very small number of women were doctors. Medicine in the 1850s is just starting slowly, those slow steps to admit women as doctors, to give them the training and the degrees that they need. And Debbie Hughes is one example. She is a doctor at the beginning of the war. However, the problems that Georgie Bacon talked about early on about having trouble with the surgeons makes it so that she cannot come in as a doctor. She comes in as a nurse. But many women who went in as nurses, they learned from that. And as medicine became more open to admitting women, a number of women who served in the war as nurses went on to become doctors. Now, a couple of quick stories, and then I'll take your questions. I want you to know that I want to give you just a little bit of a flavor of some of these stories. We don't have the time here for me to give you all the fascinating details of their lives, but each woman that I've written about, I'm going to give you their, in the book, I talk about their war experience. I tell you about their early life. And if they survive the war, I'll talk about what life was like after. So I'm just going to touch on a few of the stories that sort of stuck with me over time. One of them is Elmira Fails. She just happened to be the landlady for Clara Barton, and that was in the 1850s. So had the war not happened, Elmira might have just, and Clara too, might have been no more than roommates or a landlord-tenant relationship. So, but when South Carolina secedes from the Union, and this, of course, comes in the wake of the election of Abraham Lincoln, when South Carolina secedes, Elmira reacts in a way that puts her neighbors on edge. She begins making bandages, and this is in December of 1860. She begins making bandages because she knows that a horrible war is coming. She's convinced in it. She sees that it's coming, and she begins to prepare for it. And so her jump into action, though folks were frightened by her behavior at the time, they came to understand that she was really tragically ahead of the narrative that was about to befall the country. Sally Dysert was in Harrisburg, not all that far from you guys. And President Lincoln comes through town. She's listening. She's one of the folks standing around when Lincoln makes a few remarks, and she is so impressed. She says something to the effect of, all that was good was with him. She is so impressed that she decides that she is going to serve the Union in the best way that she can. And she does that by becoming a nurse. She follows Annie Bell, who I talked about earlier. They go to Tennessee and elsewhere with the Army of the Potomac and other armies and other Army Corps. Catherine Lawrence, who I mentioned earlier, has a book that she wrote. She was known as Kit, and she went head to head, butted heads with Dorothea Dix, two very, very strong-willed individuals. Dorothea Dix was the ranking member of the nurses. Kit was not, and Dorothea sent Kit off to the worst hospitals, the sickest hospitals, the worst stocked, the worst supplied, the most wounded, the most sick. Kit took all of this in stride. She worked as hard as she could. She survived all of this. Finally, she catches a break, and Dorothea Dix sends her to a little bit better hospital in Northern Virginia. And in that capacity, she is meeting displaced, enslaved people as they are fleeing their former owners. And she comes in contact with some young women who look, their features are more white than they are black. One of those young girls is Fanny. Long story short, Kit adopts Fanny. They travel around the North, telling their story, raising money for veterans, and continuing to do philanthropic deeds. This photograph is one that Kit would sell to make money. So she would go on tour, she would sell the photograph, she would tell her story, and it shows not only her willingness to raise money, some of those funds supported her travels, other funds supported the soldiers, but it also shows that photography is being used as a philanthropic fundraiser, which is a use of photography that becomes popular with the Civil War. Mary Jane Safford, I want to take you to the battlefield of Belmont. She is no more than a girl. She's a teenager. She leaves her home base in Cairo, Illinois, with a servant, an African-American man. They're out in the battlefield right after the battle. The ruins of the battlefield are there. The smoke is there. The wounded are looking for help. And she is out there with a white towel attached to a pole, the symbol of truce. The servant that's with her is carrying supplies or trying to help the men and get them off the battlefield. This is her entree into the service of caring for soldiers. And like many women, there's no such thing as a furlough. The idea of caregiving, the idea of personal mental health isn't like it is today. And so many women, like Mary Jane, just worked until they were driven to a state of exhaustion. She became basically broken down by her experiences. In 1862, it was so bad that her brother sent her to Europe to spend the rest of the war so she could recover and recuperate. Anna Maria Ross, Philadelphia, she plays a leading role in helping to build a hospital. She puts her heart and her soul into building this hospital. And in 1863, just before Christmas, a few days before Christmas, she passes away from complications of exhaustion. On the day she dies, they dedicate this new hospital. Mary Moore's husband, I spoke about her earlier. Her apron, I promised you that apron was important. You can see the pockets in those apron there are two of them, and they're very large and they're very deep. Mary would walk around the hospitals and she would overhear the patients say things like, gosh, I wish I had such and such a book, or I would love to play a game of checkers, or I wish I had a deck of cards, or I wish I had some writing paper. She would make notes of what the patients were asking for, and then she would get those items. She would put them in her pockets as she moved across the ward, moved through the ward, and then she would pull these items out of her apron pockets and hand them to the surprised soldiers. During or after Antietam, at the Smoketown Hospital, she spent her time living in a tent that she shared with a fellow nurse. Mary made a flag out of red flannel in the shape of a medicine bottle to let passersby, wounded folks and injured know that she had the ability to dispense medicine and take care of individuals. Helen Louise Gilson, I also mentioned her earlier, in 1864, after the Battle of the Crater, when many wounded U.S. colored infantrymen were making their way back from the battle, none of the white nurses or the white doctors were particularly eager to help the African-American men. Helen Gilson was the one who said, no, this is something that you have to do. They're soldiers and they need our help. And she was the one who first stepped out to help these men. We have no idea how many lives she saved, but she was the one that stepped in and folks followed her lead. Felicity Ann Grundy, she is a Tennessean, daughter of a Tennessee senator. And when Nashville falls to Union forces, she remains in town negotiating with the Union occupiers and trying to get goods and supplies to send to wounded Confederates that have been captured. She's the only example of a Southern woman that I found that lobbies the Confederate government to form a national organization similar to the Sanitary Commission, but because of the resource problems that I spoke about earlier, it never comes to fruition. Sister Farley, you saw her photograph as well. She's in Wheeling, West Virginia. Her church, her Catholic church, becomes a place for wounded and sick soldiers. In her reminiscences, there's a wonderful description after a hard day of nursing soldiers. These men are now in the church, but they're not in the main sanctuary, but in rooms off to the side. Sister Farley goes into one of the ante rooms and she sees 7 of her sister nurses all asleep. She describes it as soldier style. They have crude sacks for blankets and they have pillows made of leaves. And they're also exhausted after caring for the soldiers. They're all sleeping together quietly. She can see the light shining through stained glass windows and she can smell the scent of the candles in the church. It's such a beautiful moment that she describes. And it also pays tribute to the work that she and her sisters did during the war. Another woman of faith, Sybil Jones, is a Quaker. She is anti-war, as is her the doctrine that she lives by. She's a charismatic traveling Europe before the war. She is able to stir up an audience like no one's ever seen. Her husband is the very quiet biblical scholar who is on stage with her, and he adds his bit of historical information now and then, but she's the real leader. When the war happens, she puts some distance. She puts more distance when her son decides to fight. It creates a division between the family. Ultimately, they mend their fences, but soon after her son dies in battle, she then becomes involved in the war and goes on a whirlwind tour of northern hospitals. The last individual I'll talk about is Rosanna Billing. she is the classic example of her parents, like so many parents who tried to persuade their daughters not to go. And it's a common theme. You're too young, you're too frail, you're not going to be able to weather the trials and tribulations, the rigors of camp life. She goes anyway, and she works in the Washington, D.C. area. She's eventually sent to Annapolis, and she is ministering to all of the Andersonville survivors as they're coming up from Georgia in late 1864 and late 1865. At some point, as she's caring for those Andersonville survivors, she herself falls sick of typhus and she dies. Word of her honorable service and word of her death makes it through the ranks of the nursing corps. And in Washington, one of the nurses, a name you know, Walt Whitman, writes about her and says how good she was of a nurse, and also mentions that she was buried in the soldier fashion, in a casket with an honor guard, and they gave her a full military funeral. So with that, I want to thank you for listening, and very happy to take any questions you may have.
Thank you so much, Ron. Those are some fascinating stories. It's hard to keep track. I mean, there's so many different examples of, heroic sacrifice. The big takeaway for me that, I don't think it's anything particularly new when discussing war, but we know the names of the generals, we know the names of the units, we know the names of the big battles, we know about the sacrifice and the blood and all of that stuff, but these women in particular are still unsung and often very invisible. And that's why I think your presentation is so valuable. We do have several questions that have come in over the last few minutes, and I will also check for those for our friends who are watching on Facebook. I will check in a minute or two to see if there are any questions there. But feel free to use the chat function, and I'm going to start going through these right now. This question is from Jeannie, and she asks, are you familiar with the book / pamphlet, Hospital Scenes After the Battle of Gettysburg, published by the Patriot Daughters of Lancaster and published in 1864?
I'm not sure that I came across that in my travels. I would love to know more, and send me an email. I'm militaryimages@gmail.com. I would love to learn more about that. I do want to add that there are so many, and during the course of my research, I found so many writings in local historical societies, county histories that have wonderful information. And I know right here in York County, you all have some wonderful histories of your county and during the war years. So yeah, it amazes me how much wonderful primary source material is out there.
This question is from Carl. Did female nurses treat wounded near an active battle? If so, were they given special consideration by the enemy? Were efforts made not to fire in their direction?
I don't know. I didn't come across any references to non-combatants receiving sort of special attention. It varies on the circumstances on the battleground. One detail I can tell you is on the northern side, for much of the hostilities, the formal nursing organizations could only go so far. They normally, medical folks, women nurses, would often congregate in the formal camps that were close to battlefields. And it wasn't until after the battles that they would go in. Helen Gilson, who I spoke about earlier, she was a pioneer in this idea of trying to reach out into the battlefield with as soon as possible to be able to get wounded. It's a place where not many were able to go. So there's that experience. Another experience is folks like Carrie McGavock. She was at the Battle of Franklin from her home. She was right in the middle of all of this. There was no, it was not known that she was there. Everything was so fluid and moving so quickly. If there were acts of compassion on the side of the Union Army in this case, I haven't found them quite yet.
Thank you. There's a similar question here from Scott Rosenau, and I think you sort of covered this, but he just wondered if any nurses became actively involved in fighting. I think you sort of.
Yeah, there are some there are stories, and I think Marie Tepe, or French Mary, is probably the example. Her legend becomes much larger than life. You will find accounts of her leading Union troops into battle at Gettysburg. None of this is actually true. But in French Mary's case, she sort of let those stories happen because after the war, she did a little bit of traveling. She spoke to veterans groups. She fell on hard times. And so sometimes the mythology that grew up was something that in her case she embraced. But that's a rare example. So, but I did come across numerous cases of women who are they're too close to the battlefield. There's an account at Shiloh of women coming under fire. And the same is true for men who were surgeons. Think about, if you want to spread the context out a little bit further to non-combatants, the idea of hospitals, doctors and patients coming under fire. You'll find examples of those too. The general understanding was not to fire on those areas, of course, but war being as unpredictable as it is, we're seeing this right now in Ukraine. As hard as they're trying to form corridors and have some rules of engagement around this, you can see right now that it is not working. So imagine in the 19th century where the rules of war aren't quite what they are today. It's a high risk, whether it's the 21st century or 19th century. If you're going out, you're in a very high risk situation.
Just looking over the questions, and I did not see any on Facebook. This is a great opportunity for anybody. Oh, by the way, Carl, thank you for answering his question. So we appreciate the questions, and obviously it's great that Ron's able to field these.
Good. Well, I should add that the narrative, what I've sought to do in the 5 books is to capture larger narratives through human experiences of the war. So nurses, women as nurses, Navy, African-American participants, Confederate and Union. Those are the 4 larger narratives that I've mapped out. And so the nurses is the last of the 5, but certainly not the least. And what I found in each situation, and as I think you got a flavor of tonight, the motivations are so similar. The stories of courage are so similar. And when you think about, if you want to look at it in terms of gender, men had a very clear pathway to become involved in the military. You either go to your local recruiter in town and sign up to be a volunteer, or you can go to the Navy in your nearest port and sign up. And then you can, join a company, get into a regiment, be on a gunboat. That's all mapped out. It's all organized. If you're a woman, you really don't have as clear a path, and you have to fight to get on that path. It's a significant challenge, and I hope that you got a flavor of this tonight. And I think this distinguishes the difference, one of the big differences in men and women during the war. The women had to fight just to get to the starting line, whereas men could walk right in the door and get started.
You might have been reading my mind or anticipating a question I was going to ask, but just putting on my American history professor hat, one of the big topics for historians of the early republic is the cult of domesticity, and the idea that women need to, well, it's a successor to Republican motherhood. And so this idea of transition between women kind of as the mothers of good, small r Republican children that are going to grow up and be good American citizens. But then this shifts over time into women basically are limited. Their sphere is limited to the home, or almost overwhelmingly to the home. And so women like Dorothea Dix, who you mentioned a few times tonight, was able to stretch that point by saying, we're mothers, and therefore it's our duty to take care of people in what passed for mental asylums in the early 1800s. I'm just wondering, obviously they're trying to challenge Victorian values, but at some point, I would assume that for a lot of these women, they felt like they were just fulfilling their normal roles.
I think that is definitely, I think you're spot on with that observation. I do think that it is an extension. And I think they were somewhat, war wasn't the only platform for them for that extension. The development of industry in that part of the century, I think is fueling part of that. It's challenging the norms. I think the progressive movement in the 30s and 40s is certainly adding to that as well. But I think there is certainly those instincts of the motherhood and the domestic. Those norms and those traits are more or less grafted onto other parts of their lives. And I think that really carries through. And they seem to be a lot of the women that I researched after the war, those who survived, they seem to be, there's an awareness of that. And when you see them getting involved in everything from the Grand Army of the Republic to Confederate veterans, all the auxiliary organizations involved in women's suffrage, although most of them didn't live to see it, some did, they come away with a renewed, I think they're challenged to go even further and to push the limits. So I think they saw the success that that domestic motherhood grafted onto the war and onto industry and onto the economy. They experienced great successes in the 1850s and the 1860s, and that empowered them to take that further. And so I think that they learned during the war about the power of organization and the power of changing norms, and also a realization that society was changing. And I think about that a lot today, because the generation, all of us alive today, the change that we have seen in the shift to the digital age, and all the norms that have been challenged the last 2 years, a great shift to working remotely. We can actually see the change almost every day. And I believe women and men in the Civil War generation, there's a commonality, that same disintegration of old things and new things developing. You can literally being able to watch it day by day. That's a common bond. And I think that the women of that time period and the women of today, there's that common bond that is still there.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, there's a comedian named Jim Gaffigan who talks about,
I know him.
often talks about talks about women in his routines. And he says, and I mean this in a very pandering way, but the way in which women have risen to the challenge as nurses, as mothers,
Yeah.
as teachers over the last 2 years have preserved their civilization. I think is maybe a fair way to summarize it.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your presentation and for your time sharing all these great stories and photos with us tonight. I don't see any additional comments, so I think we'll wind things up. If you have any further comments, please feel free to share them, Ron.
Good. I will just want to thank everybody again. Adam, thank you. Kathy, thank you. Thanks for everyone for tuning in and thinking of Kim right now. So
Thank you so much. We appreciate
sure.
that.
Thank you. Thanks all.
Right. And we'll see everybody next month. I think it's April 20th. And thank you for all your comments and for your participation in the chat tonight.